Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be here. This is a big one.
It really is. Today, we're tackling something that, well, it feels incredibly current, even though our source material is going to take us back a couple of decades.
It's a pattern, not an event.
Exactly. We're looking at a collection of essays, a book titled Acts of Aggression, the United States and Rogue States.
And this is quite the lineup of authors. You have three very distinct, very critical voices. There's Noam Chomsky, the linguist and political analyst.
Right.
Then you have Edward Said, the literary critic, really the founder of post-colonial studies.
And the third is Ramsey Clark.
Ramsey Clark, who is the former U.S. Attorney General. So you have this combination of political analysis, cultural critique, and legal insight, all focused on one concept.
And that concept, the rogue state, is what immediately grabbed me. It's a term we all know, you hear it on the news all the time. It's this simple label for the bad guys on the world stage.
The international villains.
Yes. But this book just flips that entire idea on its head. The authors argue that the label rogue state isn't actually about who's good or evil. It's a structural tool. It's a classification system.
A mechanism.
A mechanism that determines who gets to be sanctioned, who gets bombed, and maybe just as importantly, who gets ignored.
Precisely. And that's why we wanted to do this deep dive. Our goal here isn't to make moral judgments, to say this leader is better or worse than another.
No, not at all.
We want to look at the incentive architecture. We want to get under the hood and understand the mechanics of foreign policy, the utility of having an enemy, and what happens when raw power collides with international law.
Right. So let's set the scene for everyone listening. The essays in this book were written around 1998, 1999.
So the context is key. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed. For the first time in decades, the U.S. is the undisputed unipolar global power.
The so-called end of history moment.
A lot of people thought so. And the specific geopolitical focus of these essays is the simmering tension with Iraq. You have this brutal sanctions regime in place and the constant looming threat of military action.
And the central argument, the thesis that Chomsky said and Clark are all building towards is, well, it's pretty provocative.
To say the least.
They're basically arguing that the rogue state designation is a weapon in disguise. It's a tool that allows a dominant power, in this case the U.S. and its main ally, the U.K., to selectively enforce international norms.
Which in turn allows them to justify their own actions, even when those actions might violate the very same international laws they claim to be upholding. It's a tool for masking hypocrisy.
So let's start unpacking that. The first most obvious question has to be, what exactly is a rogue state? If we're going to talk about the system, we need to define the core component.
And that's the perfect starting point, because Chomsky's analysis begins right there. He points out that if you go looking for a legal definition of rogue state, you won't find one.
It's not in the UN Charter.
Not at all. It has no actual standing in international law. It is purely, and this is his point, a creation of policy planning. It's a political term, not a legal one.
Okay, so if it's not a legal term, what is the operational definition? How do we know one when we see one?
Well, by looking at how the label is applied, Chomsky argues the functional definition is actually incredibly simple.
Which is?
A rogue state is a state that defies the orders of the powerful.
That's it. It's just disobedience.
In the final analysis, yes. It's a state that refuses to submit to the will of the dominant superpower. And to understand why this specific term became so popular in the 1990s, you have to look at the power vacuum that was created by the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The end of the Cold War.
Exactly. For nearly 50 years, the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, they all justified their existence, their budgets, their interventions based on the Soviet threat.
This single, monolithic, existential enemy.
Right, the evil empire. But then, almost overnight, it just vanished. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the primary justification for a massive global military presence disappeared with it.
And you can't really justify a Cold War-level defense budget if you don't have a Cold War-level enemy.
You can't. So as Chomsky lays out, the rhetoric had to shift. The narrative needed a new villain. You couldn't talk about fighting the Red Menace anymore. So the story changed. It shifted to fighting rogue states.
And that's a different kind of enemy, isn't it? The Soviet Union was portrayed as this calculating, rational, chess-playing opponent.
A rival superpower, yes. Predictable in its own way. But rogue states, they were framed as something else entirely, irrational, unpredictable, volatile, run by madmen.
Which, in a way, makes them sound even more dangerous. You can, in theory, negotiate with a rational actor. You can't reason with a madman.
And that's the utility of the term. It shuts down the possibility of diplomacy. It frames the situation as one where force is the only language the other side will understand.
This is where the analysis gets, well, frankly, a little disturbing. Because the authors point out a deep structural irony in how this is framed.
They do. Chomsky, in particular, digs up a fascinating document from 1995. It's a study from the U.S. Strategic Command.
And just to be clear, who is the Strategic Command?
Stratcom. They are the part of the U.S. military responsible for the nuclear arsenal, for strategic deterrence. So these are the most serious planners in the Pentagon.
Okay, so not some fringe group. This is the heart of the defense establishment.
The absolute core. And this document is called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence.
I remember reading this section and just having to stop and reread it. It almost sounds like a villain's monologue from a movie.
It's quite something. The study explicitly discusses the strategic value of appearing irrational. It argues that for U.S. deterrence to remain effective after the Cold War, the U.S. should not project an image of being too fully rational or cool-headed.
Wait, hold on. The official strategy of the superpower is to act like a rogue.
That's the core of it. The document goes on to suggest that it is actually beneficial for the U.S. to project an image of being, and this is the idea, irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked.
To weaponize fear. To make your adversary think you're just crazy enough to do something completely disproportionate.
It's the madman theory.
Which Nixon was famous for. The idea that if the other side thinks you're a lunatic, they won't dare cross you.
Chomsky notes that connection explicitly. It's a resurrection of the madman theory for a unipolar world. But the authors are pointing out the incredible hypocrisy here.
Because we're labeling countries like Iraq or North Korea or Libya as rogue states on the grounds that they're irrational and dangerous.
Exactly. We condemn them for the very behavior that our own internal strategic planning documents are recommending we adopt.
It creates a feedback loop, doesn't it? We project unpredictability to intimidate them. They react defensively or aggressively because they're being intimidated.
And their reaction is then held up as proof that they were irrational rogues all along.
Which then justifies our initial aggressive posture. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And that cycle is what creates the crisis in perception. We see their aggression as a fundamental part of their evil nature. We see our aggression as a calculated, necessary, even rational strategic choice.
But look, there are supposed to be rules for this. The world isn't just the Wild West. We have the United Nations. We have the UN Charter. A country can't just decide it's going to attack another country. Isn't there a legal process?
And that brings us to the second major pillar of the book's argument, the inherent conflict between the established legal framework and the reality of realpolitik.
So let's talk about the law. What does the UN Charter, which, as the book points out, is a treaty the U.S. has signed and ratified, actually say about using force?
Well, according to the U.S. Constitution, ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. So, in theory, the UN Charter is binding on the U.S. government.
And what are its terms?
The Charter is remarkably clear. Article 2.4 explicitly bans the threat or use of force in international relations. It's the foundational principle of the modern international order.
It's banned completely, no exceptions.
There are two, and only two, very specific and narrowly defined exceptions.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is when the UN Security Council authorizes the use of force under Chapter 7 of the Charter. This is Articles 41 and 42. It's when the international community as a whole agrees that there's a threat to peace and security and collectively decides to act.
So that's the multilateral option, the world acting together. What's the second exception?
The second is Article 51. It recognizes the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations.
An armed attack, that seems very specific, like tanks are literally rolling across your border.
That is the plain reading of the text. You are being attacked, and you have the right to defend yourself until the Security Council can take measures to restore peace.
Okay, so those are the only two legal justifications for war.
According to the supreme law of the land, yes. But the authors argue that in practice, the U.S. has developed what they call a unilateral interpretation that effectively renders the Charter meaningless.
And this is where that famous quote from Madeleine Albright comes in.
It perfectly captures the doctrine. When she was UN ambassador and later as Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, she articulated the policy that the U.S. will act multilaterally when we can and unilaterally when we must.
When we must. That sounds very flexible. Who gets to decide when it's a must?
The United States decides, based on its own definition of its national interest. The text is filled with quotes from Clinton administration officials saying that if the Security Council doesn't agree with U.S. policy, the U.S. reserves the right to go it alone.
So if the Court of International Law doesn't give you the verdict you want, you just ignore the court and appoint yourself judge and jury.
That is the core of the critique. The book then shows how Article 51, the self-defense clause, has been stretched to the breaking point to justify all sorts of actions.
Give me an example from the text.
Well, they cite the 1986 bombing of Libya. The Reagan administration didn't claim Libya had launched an armed attack on the U.S. They justified it as self-defense against future attack, an act of preemption.
Which isn't what Article 51 says.
Not even close. Or look at the 1989 invasion of Panama. The justification was a mix of protecting American lives, stopping drug trafficking, and restoring democracy, none of which constitutes an armed attack against the United States.
It sounds like the definition of self-defense has been expanded to mean something more like defense of our interests, wherever they may be.
That's it, exactly. And this is where Chomsky introduces a really powerful analogy. He says the U.S. and the U.K. like to present themselves as the world's policemen.
You hear that phrase all the time.
But think about what a policeman is supposed to do in a functioning legal system. A cop apprehends a suspect. They don't get to hold a trial on the sidewalk.
No, they bring them before a judge.
They enforce the law. They don't operate outside of it. A policeman doesn't get to decide guilt, pass a sentence, and carry out the execution all by themselves because they have a hunch.
If a police officer did that, they'd be a criminal, a murderer.
Right. But in the international system that the book describes, the self-appointed enforcer is exempt from the very rules they apply to the suspect. The rogue state must adhere to every comma in every UN resolution.
But the policeman can choose to ignore the UN Charter itself whenever it's inconvenient.
And that's the structural breakdown. It's not just about one or two instances of hypocrisy. It's about the collapse of the legal order itself.
Which brings us to the human impact of all this. Because while diplomats in New York are arguing about the interpretation of Article 51, real people are living and dying with the consequences.
Yes. And this is where the book shifts focus to the primary tool of this system in the 1990s, sanctions.
Ramsey Clark's essay on this is, it's brutal. He doesn't pull any punches. He flat out calls the sanctions on Iraq a weapon of mass destruction.
It's an incredibly strong claim, especially coming from a former attorney general. But he backs it up, not with rhetoric, but with data. His argument is that sanctions are sold to the public as a peaceful alternative to war.
Right. The clean option. We're not dropping bombs. We're just applying economic pressure until the dictator changes his ways.
But Clark argues that this is a complete misrepresentation. He says that comprehensive economic sanctions are a form of warfare, and a particularly cruel one because they are indiscriminate. They punish the most vulnerable people in a society.
The statistics cited in the text are just staggering. I wrote them down here. The authors cite sources estimating over 1.5 million deaths in total in Iraq as a result of the sanctions regime.
And the most horrific figure, the one that really sticks with you, comes from a UNICEF report at the time.
The children.
Yes. UNICEF reported that 567,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 had died as a direct consequence of the sanctions.
500,000 children.
And in a 1996 report, they estimated that 4,500 children were dying every month.
It's almost impossible to process a number like that. 4,500 kids a month. What was actually killing them?
It was a combination of malnutrition and disease. But it wasn't just a simple lack of food. The real issue was the total collapse of the country's infrastructure. You have to remember, the 1991 Gulf War deliberately targeted and destroyed Iraq's civilian infrastructure.
Things like water treatment plants, power grids.
Exactly. Electrical stations, sewage systems, hospitals. The sanctions then prevented Iraq from importing the parts and materials needed to rebuild any of it.
And this is where the dual-use blockade comes in. That was the specific mechanism, right?
It was. There was a UN committee, known as the 661 Committee, that had to approve everything that went into Iraq. And the U.S. and the U.K. held effective veto power on that committee.
So they could block anything.
They could, and they did. They blocked items on the grounds that they were dual use, meaning they could theoretically have a military application.
But the examples in the book are just insane. They were blocking ambulances.
Ambulances, on the theory that they could be used to transport troops. Tires, because they could be put on military vehicles. Shovels.
Shovels?
Yes. Insecticides, which were desperately needed to combat disease and protect crops, were blocked because they contain chemicals that, in large quantities, could be precursor elements for weapons
And chlorine for water purification was blocked?
for the same reason. So you have a civilian population that is forced to drink contaminated water, leading to explosive outbreaks of cholera and dysentery. But there are no medicines to treat them because those are blocked too. And even if you could find a doctor, there are no ambulances to get you to the collapsing hospitals.
So the authors are arguing this wasn't an unfortunate side effect. This was structural violence built into the design of the sanctions.
Exactly. But here is the great paradox, and this is a critical systems insight from the book. Did any of this actually hurt the target? Did it weaken Saddam Hussein's grip on power?
Well, historically, we know the answer is no. He stayed in power for years after this, right up until the 2003 invasion.
And the text argues that the sanctions, counterintuitively, actually strengthened his regime.
How is that possible? How does destroying your country's society make the leader stronger?
Because it obliterated the middle class. It destroyed any semblance of a private economy and made every single person in the country completely dependent on the state for their survival.
The government rationing system.
The only food you could get was from the government's ration basket. So if you were an Iraqi citizen with a family to feed, you couldn't afford to be a dissident. If you stepped out of line, if you protested against Saddam, your family's ration card would be pulled and you would starve.
So by crushing civil society, the sanctions made it impossible for the people to organize and overthrow the very dictator they were meant to punish.
It's the box, as the authors call it. The Clinton administration's stated policy was regime change, Saddam had to go. But the primary tool they were using to achieve that goal, the sanctions, was making the population too weak, too fragmented, and too dependent to ever rise up.
The outcome was the total destruction of a society, while the leadership, the actual rogues, were left secure in their palaces, their power actually consolidated.
It's a textbook example of incentives versus outcomes. The stated intent might have been disarmament and containment, but the actual observable outcome was a humanitarian catastrophe that entrenched the dictator.
And Ramsey Clark's point is that this wasn't some hidden secret. The UNICEF data was public. Senior UN humanitarian coordinators in Iraq, like Dennis Halliday, resigned in protest, calling the sanctions regime genocidal.
The information was out there, but the policy continued for over a decade.
Which raises the next crucial question: why? How does a democratic society, a country that sees itself as a beacon of human rights, look at 5,000 dying children a month and decide, yes, this is a necessary and worthwhile policy?
And that question leads us directly into the third part of the book's argument, Edward Said's analysis of narrative and cultural perception.
Said is just brilliant on this topic. He talks about the critical role of dehumanization.
He argues that there's this deep, almost unbridgeable cultural gulf in the American imagination between us and the Arab world. In Western media and in politics, he argues, Arabs are so often portrayed as a monolith.
Not as individuals, but as a type.
A type, exactly. They're seen as terrorists, religious fanatics, irrational actors. They're not seen as complex individuals or societies with legitimate grievances or aspirations.
So when we see images of suffering from Iraq, we don't necessarily see people like us. We see those people.
They become what Said calls the unworthy victim. Their suffering is rendered abstract, invisible, or, at best, a secondary concern to the main geopolitical drama. If a child dies in a Western capital, it's an unimaginable tragedy that fills the news for weeks.
Right.
If thousands of children die in Baghdad as a result of a policy decision made in Washington, it's framed as a regrettable but necessary cost of doing business. It's a statistic, not a tragedy.
Said also has this fascinating phrase, the puritanical zeal in American foreign policy. That idea really stuck with me.
It's a powerful insight. He's arguing that there's a specific tendency in the American psyche to view foreign policy not just as a strategic exercise, but as a moral crusade.
A battle between good and evil.
Yes, a kind of religious anger. We don't just see a rogue leader as a political adversary who has violated norms. We see him as a sinner, an irredeemable, unregenerate sinner who must be punished for his wickedness.
And if you're dealing with pure evil, then any level of punishment is justified.
It calls for apocalyptic punishment, in Saidi's words. It justifies inflicting total devastation on the entire country to get at the sinner at the top. He draws a direct parallel to the historical treatment of Native Americans in the U.S. First, you demonize them as godless savages, and then you justify their extermination or confinement.
It's the logic behind phrases like bombing them back to the Stone Age. That was a real thing people were saying.
It absolutely was. And this entire narrative is, of course, mediated and amplified by the press. Both Chomsky and Said hit this point hard. The media focuses on the fireworks,
The spectacle of it all.
the aircraft carriers leaving port, the smart bombs hitting their targets with pinpoint precision, the generals giving press briefings with grainy, green-tinted footage. It's presented as a clean, technological techno-war.
It looks surgical and sterile on television.
Exactly. But the structural violence? The slow, grinding death from cholera, from malnutrition, from a lack of basic medicine, that doesn't make for compelling television. It happens quietly, in the shadows, off camera.
So the media, whether intentionally or not, manufactures consent by focusing on the spectacle of American power rather than the human reality of its consequences.
And by systematically marginalizing dissenting voices. The text points out that 54 Catholic bishops in the U.S. publicly condemned the sanctions on humanitarian grounds.
I've never heard that before.
And you probably didn't hear it on the nightly news in 1998. The entire public conversation was framed around one question. Is Saddam complying with weapons inspectors?
Not, are we complicit in a humanitarian disaster?
The power to frame the question is the power to determine the answer. If the problem is Saddam's defiance, then more bombing and more sanctions are the logical solution. If the problem is a humanitarian catastrophe, then lifting the sanctions is the solution. The narrative frame dictates the policy.
Okay, I want to zoom out for a minute. We've talked about the definition, the law, the sanctions, and the narrative that holds it all together. But for me, the most powerful part of the book's argument was the systems mapping the analysis of double standards.
The selectivity of it all.
Because if this was really about punishing countries for violating international law or abusing human rights, then the rules would be applied to everyone equally, right?
That's the logical test. Is the rogue state label applied consistently to all violators? And the comparative analysis the authors provide is, well, it's pretty damning.
Let's walk through some of the cases they bring up. They start with Indonesia under Suharto.
Right. General Suharto took power in Indonesia in 1965. The text notes that his rise was accompanied by a massive slaughter estimate, ranged from 500,000 to 1 million people killed, landless peasants, unionists, suspected communists.
A bloodbath.
An absolute bloodbath. And then in 1975, he invaded the small nation of East Timor. It was a brutal, illegal occupation that killed off perhaps a third of the population and was condemned by multiple UN resolutions.
Okay, so massive internal slaughter, illegal invasion of a neighbor. That sounds like a prime candidate for rogue status.
By any objective measure, yes.
Yeah.
But was he ever labeled a rogue? Was Indonesia sanctioned? No. In fact, the Clinton administration officially described Suharto as our kind of guy.
Our kind of guy. And why was that?
Because he was a reliable strategic ally. He was staunchly anti-communist during the Cold War. He opened up Indonesia's vast natural resources to Western corporations, and his regime was a cornerstone of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia.
So the U.S. just looked the other way.
The book argues it was worse than that. The U.S. actively supplied arms and diplomatic cover to Indonesia during the worst of the atrocities in East Timor.
Unbelievable. Okay, what's the next case study? Turkey.
Turkey, a key NATO ally. The text highlights that throughout the 1990s, the Turkish military was engaged in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against its own Kurdish population in the southeast of the country.
Which involved?
Thousands of villages destroyed, millions of people forcibly displaced, widespread reports of torture and extrajudicial killings.
Now, hold on. A central justification for punishing Saddam Hussein was his brutal treatment of the Kurds in Iraq.
Precisely. That is the core of the comparison. When Saddam attacks Kurds, it's presented as evidence of his monstrous rogue nature justifying sanctions and war. When our NATO ally Turkey attacks Kurds, often with the U.S.-supplied weapons, it's framed as a legitimate internal security matter.
It's the exact same act. The victim group is even the same. The only variable that changes is the perpetrator's relationship with the United States.
That's the asymmetry in the system. And then, of course, the book turns to Israel.
Another key U.S. ally.
The text points out that Israel has, over the decades, violated dozens of UN Security Council resolutions regarding its occupation of Palestinian territories and its actions in Lebanon.
But the U.S. response isn't to impose crippling sanctions.
The U.S. response is to use its veto power in the Security Council to block any resolutions that would censure or sanction Israel. So you have this stark contrast, the harshest, most apocalyptic enforcement of UN resolutions against Iraq versus a protective shield of vetoes for an ally.
And maybe the most revealing example of all is Saddam Hussein himself. We tend to forget this, but he wasn't always the arch-villain.
Not at all.
Mm.
The book reminds us that in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam's Iraq was a strategic partner of the United States. He received loans, agricultural credits, satellite intelligence.
And this was after he had already committed horrific acts.
This is the crucial point. The authors mention the infamous chemical weapons attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja in 1988, a clear and undeniable war crime.
And the U.S. response at the time was,
To continue supporting him. There were no sanctions, no calls for regime change, no bombing of Baghdad. Why? Because at that moment he was a useful bulwark against Iran, which was seen as the greater enemy after the 1979 revolution.
so gassing his own people didn't make him a rogue. It was only when he invaded Kuwait in 1990, when he disobeyed the geopolitical order of the region, that he was suddenly transformed into the new Hitler.
He became a rogue when he stopped being useful, when he stepped out of line and challenged the authority of, to use a phrase for the book, the masters of the universe.
This is what really clarifies the crisis in perception for me. The whole system only works if the public is encouraged to see each of these crises in isolation, in a vacuum.
It relies on fragmentation.
Because if you actually put Iraq, Indonesia, Turkey, and Israel on the table and looked at their records all at once, the moral argument for intervention in Iraq completely collapses.
It dissolves. And what's left is not a moral argument, but a structural one. The rogue state label isn't a category of misbehavior. It's a tool of power maintenance. It's a sticker you apply to your enemies to grant yourself a license to attack them, while you hand out get-out-of-jail-free cards to your friends.
It effectively creates two tiers of international law, a strict version for your adversaries and a non-existent version for yourself and your allies.
And that, the authors argue, destroys the very concept of law. Because for something to be law, it must, by definition, be applied universally. If a rule only applies to the weak and never to the strong, it's not law. It's just a command. It's just power.
So let's connect this to the present day. Sticking to that systems view, why does this framework persist? Why do we still hear the term rogue state or similar labels today?
The simple answer is because the system works for those in power. It continues to serve the interests of the dominant state.
In what way specifically?
The book touches on a few key incentives. The first is domestic and institutional. We've already mentioned the military-industrial complex. You need a constant stream of threats to justify a defense budget that dwarfs the rest of the world's combined.
And rogue states are the perfect kind of threat.
They're what you might call Goldilocks threat. They're scary enough to justify massive spending on new weapon systems, but they're not actually powerful enough to pose a real existential threat or win a war against the U.S.
Manageable enemies.
Manageable enemies. Then there's the crucial resource angle. The authors note, almost as an aside, the geopolitical importance of the Persian Gulf's energy reserves.
Control the flow of oil, and you have leverage over the entire global economy.
Precisely. The rogue state narrative provides a permanent justification for a heavy U.S. military footprint in the world's most resource-rich regions. If Iraq or Iran is a threat to global security, then it becomes imperative that we have aircraft carrier battle groups in the Gulf and military bases in neighboring countries. It legitimizes the projection of power.
And it also serves as a warning to other countries, doesn't it? If you see what happens to a designated rogue, you're going to think twice before you challenge the established order.
It's an object lesson. It sends a clear signal that national sovereignty is conditional. You are a sovereign nation as long as you play by the rules set by the hegemon. The moment you defy those rules, your sovereignty can be revoked.
It's a deeply sobering analysis. It strips away all the comforting rhetoric about spreading freedom and democracy and leaves you with the bare, cold mechanics of power.
And that is exactly what Chomsky said and Clark are trying to get the reader to see. They are not, and we should be very clear about this, making an argument that Saddam Hussein was a good person.
No, absolutely not.
They were arguing that the system used to contain and punish him was designed not for justice, but for the maintenance and expansion of power, and that the catastrophic human cost of that system was paid by millions of innocent people.
So as we begin to wrap up this deep dive into acts of aggression, what's the single biggest takeaway? How should this analysis change the way we as citizens consume news about foreign policy?
I think the fundamental shift is learning to move from a good guys versus bad guys narrative to a power and compliance narrative. The next time you hear a political leader or a news anchor label a country a rogue state or a threat to the international order, the first question you should ask is, what specific order are they threatening?
Are they violating international law in a way our allies are not? Or are they simply violating the strategic and economic interests of a superpower?
And look for the silences. Look for who is not being condemned for doing the exact same things. That's where you see the system at work.
And finally, look past the fireworks. Look past the videos of surgical strikes and ask about the water treatment plants, the hospital incubators, the price of bread. That's where the real story often is.
The crisis in perception, as this book defines it, is that we are trained to mistake the selective enforcement of power for the impartial administration of justice. The authors are asking us to see the difference.
Which leaves us with the final provocative thought from this material, a question for everyone to really mull over. If international law is only binding on the weak and can be ignored at will by the powerful, does it truly exist as law at all? Or is it merely another tool in the arsenal of the strong?
A question that is just as relevant today as it was when this book was written.
We have covered a huge amount of ground here, from the political construction of the rogue state to the brutal mechanics of sanctions, the deep irony of a madman strategy, and the glaring double standards of global policing.
It is a difficult book, filled with uncomfortable truths, but an absolutely essential one for understanding the architecture of our modern world.
I completely agree. The book, again, is Acts of Aggression: The United States and Rogue States, with essays by Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, and Ramsey Clark. We strongly encourage you to seek it out and read the source material for yourself. The arguments are dense, meticulously cited, and far more powerful than we could ever fully capture here.
It is well worth your time.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.